Okay, so I think we're going to get started. So today is our first lecture with a live person in front of us, and so really excited about that. We have Mark Stapp who's going to talk to us about Soren Kierkegaard, who you may or may not know who that is, but he'll explain it, and Silicon Valley, which you definitely do know, and the interesting juxtaposition of these two ways of thinking, ways of being. Next week we will have Chris Stauber from Kindi to talk to us about natural language processing and how we communicate with machines and the social and legal implications of that. So these two talks I think will go quite well together. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Mark Stapp, works here on campus in our development office and is also has a philosophy degree and continues to work and write and present on Soren Kierkegaard. So let's welcome Mark to the stage. Thank you very much.
As John mentioned, I work in the advancement office. And have any of you or your parents gotten letters in the mail that asked for donations to Sonoma State University? Well, if you haven't, you will be getting more of those. Those come out of my office. We do fundraising and PR for the university. And then, as John mentioned, I sort of moonlight as a philosopher still once in a while. I've been at Sonoma State for 3 years, but prior to that, spent most of my career in the tech industry for a couple of firms. One based out in Boston, and then one in San Francisco. And when I was out in Boston, my firm gave me the chance to go move back to Chicago so I could take classes at the University of Chicago while still working for the firm. Graduate school classes, I should say, in philosophy. So I spent my days working with software engineers, designing and rolling out software. And then at night, I read Kierkegaard. So it was an odd and time-consuming and expensive hobby. But then after that, my wife and I lived in San Francisco for 10 years. Now, I was working at a different software firm, and our friends were working at Apple and Facebook and Google or startups. And if you're living in San Francisco, you're part of the Silicon Valley culture there. And as some of you probably are aware, it's a fascinating culture. And so that was another trigger for this topic. What would Kierkegaard have thought about it? Because he would have loved certain aspects of it. Kierkegaard would have loved the Tesla driving and the Soylent Shake drinking and the Apple Gold Watch wearing. There's a lot of stuff he'd have been into, but some of the stuff would have caused him to raise an eyebrow. And so we'll talk a little bit about this today. How many of you have actually read Kierkegaard? That can't be true. Is that what we're looking at here?
Looks like it.
How many of you know who wrote the books at the top of the philosophy page website? How many of you can hazard a guess? Whoops. So Kierkegaard is at the top of the philosophy website. There once was a world-class Kierkegaard scholar here by the name of Ed Mooney. He left about a decade ago. But it was actually how I first heard of Sonoma State, as I was reading his writings. And it's a legacy, it's one of his legacies that Kierkegaard still, at least on the website, if not into the curriculum. And so I'm glad we got a
picture of his library.
So it's important that we get him back into the discussion here on campus, given the historical legacy. And the CELS lecture is the perfect place to do it, because there are not many thinkers that have thought as much about law, ethics, or society as Kierkegaard. So it's a good chance to talk about him today. We'll do just a basic overview of his thought, especially since not many people in the room are familiar. And then we'll talk a little. Then we'll get more into the subject of what Kierkegaard would think about Silicon Valley by talking about the ways that Kierkegaard's own intellectual climate and times were similar to what we have today, particularly in our geographic area, being so close to the valley. And then we'll look at a couple of issues that Silicon Valley is spending a lot of time and money working on. And they happen to be issues that Kierkegaard also spent a lot of time thinking about. And we'll hypothesize about what Kierkegaard might have to say about those issues. You could do worse for an introduction to Kierkegaard's thought than to follow the Twitter feed of Kim Kierkegaardashian. Please tell me that a few of you have at least gone here. All right, well, Kim Kierkegaardashian leads a busy life. All right, she's always jetting off to photo shoots in Ibiza. She's got gym appointments to make, spa appointments. She's heading off to Paris, right? She's got a busy daily life. But Kim Kierkegaardashian also has she spends a lot of time thinking about the higher things in life, right? You know, what does it all mean? What's the purpose of my life? Am I a good friend? She's got more eternal concerns that are on her mind, and she's constantly having to balance the two, right? She's tired from the gym, she's got to make her plane to Paris, but she also wants to think, you know, about what it all means. And so her Twitter feed goes into the eternal conundrum. And again, Kierkegaard focuses a lot on these issues. So if you don't want to read Kierkegaard, you could go to Kim Kierkegaardashian. If we get a little deeper into his thought, let's talk a little bit about some Kierkegaard party trivia. And I emphasize party trivia because while you may be able to get away now at the parties you're going to at Sonoma State by name-dropping Kant and Aristotle and John Rawls, once you graduate, you're not going to be able to go to parties and name-drop those folks. No one cares. There are very few thinkers that you can walk into a party after graduation and talk about and seem cool. And Kierkegaard is one of those, right? It makes you seem literate, makes you seem interesting. So here's a few, even if you never pick up Kierkegaard, here's a few party facts to bring with you into the future. He's considered to be the father of existentialism. You're probably familiar with names like Nietzsche and Camus and Sartre and Heidegger. You probably read a few of those, at least in your other classes. Well, Kierkegaard is the person that is considered to be the guy who started that all off, right? And the existentialists, they're a loosely affiliated group. There isn't really a school of existentialism in the same way that there's like a Platonic school. It's a group of thinkers that are bundled together, that are all very different, but they tended to think about what it is to go through life as a finite human being. Right, to think about issues from an existential perspective. So as a limited, nervous creature, how do I face these issues in my life? And Kierkegaard was one of the first to really start approaching philosophy in this way, and he inspired others after him. The second party fact is his name. If you want to sound knowledgeable at parties in the future, drop the D at the end of his name. So it's Kierkegaard, right? That's how the Danes do it. And if you're at the party and people start talking about Kierkegaard with the hard D, just sort of roll your eyes, know that you know better. And if you're at a really literate party in the future and you drop Kierkegaard's name, you'll have people say, "Ah, yes, the leap of faith," because this is the phrase that's most often associated with him. You've heard this phrase before, leap of faith. All right, it stems from Kierkegaard because he talks a lot about faith and he has a lot of leaping metaphors, but he doesn't actually use that phrase in his writings. So if at a party someone drops that line with you, you can just turn around and walk away and feel superior. A few biographical highlights. He lived in the early part of the 19th century during what was known as Denmark's Golden Age. All right, so this is a time. So Denmark at this point, Denmark is a small country today. Back then it was even smaller. Kierkegaard's living in Copenhagen, which was the intellectual center of Denmark. The total population was probably 100,000 people. It was like Santa Rosa. Right? But within that small area, it was turning out figures like Kierkegaard himself, Hans Christian Andersen, H.C. Ørsted, the father of electromagnetism. There were a ton, in every intellectual area, there was a thinker that was really making a mark both in Denmark and in Europe more broadly. So it was an exciting time to be in Denmark and in Copenhagen. And Kierkegaard was born to one of the wealthiest families in Copenhagen. So not only was he right at the center of the intellectual milieu and what was going on there, but his family was very prominent. Second wealthiest family in Denmark, we think. He wrote prodigiously. In about 10 years, he turned out 30-plus books, plus a lot of unpublished materials. You saw a picture of his books earlier. If you go to the library and you look at his works, his published books are like yay. They're big. And he's got an unpublished stack that's almost equally as large. And he turned it all out in 10 years or so. He was writing all the time. And his writings all focus on what it's like for individuals to pursue truth and fulfillment in their individual lives as existing beings, right? Those existential questions. And you can see a little bit of this in one of Kierkegaard's critiques of his era. And he had a lot of critiques of his era. He looked around at Copenhagen society and European society more generally and thought, I'm not so sure I like the way this is going. And interestingly enough, for our topic today, it was precisely because of the fact that there was this explosion of knowledge and technological progress during his day that he thought was causing people to become distracted from other equally, if not more important aspects of their lives. You see that in this quote. You know, it's because of the copiousness of knowledge, because of how much knowledge there is. People in our day have forgotten what it is to exist, right? What it is to go through life as an existing being. And Kierkegaard wanted to highlight that dilemma and make people think a little bit more carefully. Kierkegaard was one of the first to call out the slacktivist tendencies of his day. I'm including the quote from Hegel here. Is Hegel a name that you're familiar with? Georg Friedrich Wilhelm Hegel? All right, towering figure in 19th century philosophy, still very influential today. And he was the philosopher that Kierkegaard spent most of his time writing against for various reasons. But I ran across this quote from Hegel, and it was apt enough that I wanted to include it here. You can see what Hegel, writing in 1799, 1801, I forget, right at the turn of the 19th century, you can see what he thought of the political life of his day. You know, it's devoid of principle, of action, and of confidence. Moral views, individual opinion, and conviction without objective truth have attained authority, and the pursuit of private rights and enjoyment is the order of the day. Thank heavens we've advanced so far beyond that, right? No longer applicable to our own time. But Kierkegaard certainly agreed with that assessment of the political age. And here was what Kierkegaard thought of his ages, of the responses of his contemporaries to that political climate, right? People were sensible, they reflected, they were momentarily enthusiastic. You know, they went on Facebook and liked whatever the political engagement of the day was, and then they relaxed, right? He was not at all confident that people of his time were paying attention to what was going on around them and thinking clearly and taking action as appropriate. A few more similarities between the early 19th and the 21st centuries. I mentioned earlier that this was a time of rapid scientific progress in both times. I mean, we know what's going on in our own age, right? We're all sitting outside before the lecture staring at our iPhones. You know, we're all wondering what to order from Uber Eats. We know the progress that we're making. Well, in Kierkegaard's time, you're talking about things, I mean, you're coming up on the heels of the scientific revolution and the environment, and the Enlightenment, rather. You've got the invention of the battery, the steam engine, the steam locomotive, medical, you know, huge medical advances. There was just a ton going on the scientific and technological front that was really coloring the opinions of people of the day, right? There was a lot of confidence in human reason to solve any issue. And you saw this confidence in reason and this confidence in progress in other areas as well. So without going too much into the history of the time, you can think about the transition from feudalism to more of a market economy. You've got people moving en masse from the rural areas into the cities. You've got huge political changes. And we think we live in interesting political times now. Well, in 1848, 7 or 8 European countries went democratic. You know, monarchies disappeared. This is right in the middle of Kierkegaard's writing career. Denmark was one of those countries that suddenly had a revolution. So there was a lot going on. And the general sense was that this was all progress for the good, and it was going to continue indefinitely. There was the sense that this progress was built in, and as long as we keep thinking harder and thinking more clearly, we're on to new and better things. To the extent, so great was this confidence that there was this weird, almost quasi-religious tendency of the time that, again, is mirrored in our own time, that we were on the cusp of evolving into something like a new species. This sounds crazy, but check it out. Have any of you ever heard the phrases either the Hegelian dialectic or the Hegelian system? All right, we should change that as well. Now, believe it or not, in the late 19th or the late 18th century and early 19th century, philosophy was dominated by the gentleman I mentioned called Hegel, Georg Friedrich Wilhelm Hegel. He created a giant system, and I've got the full system on my wall in my office. And this system collected all human knowledge, all that was to be known at that time, organized it in such a way that it looked inevitable, that it looked, first of all, complete, and it looked as though we understood exactly how these areas of knowledge flowed from one to the other. So everything from elementary particles and primitive forms of human life, all the way up to art, religion, and philosophy. We understood how it all fit together, and we could see the world, we could see the entire cosmos, the entire development of the universe, essentially as God sees it, right? We knew all that there was to be known. Maybe there were a few gaps here and there to be filled in, but conceptually, we got it. History was over, and with this understanding, we had become something like a new species, a new quasi-divine species. I know, it's crazy, right? But then think about what's going on in Silicon Valley right now with the latest quasi-religious trend of the singularity. Is this a term that's familiar to a few folks in this room? All right, well, now's our chance to think about it. The idea behind the singularity, and it's as much almost a quasi-religion, is that our technology and our understanding are advancing so quickly, and we're on the cusp of developing artificial intelligence that is robust enough to sort of to qualify as a, well, how do I want to put this? Our understanding of intelligence and our development of artificial intelligence is developing so quickly that we're on the cusp of inventing something that might plausibly be called a new life form, like a new consciousness, right? And there's debates about how quickly is it going to happen. It's going to happen 5 years from now, 20 years from now, but there's in certain sectors, there's agreement that it's going to happen inevitably. Progress is inevitable. And then once we've got this robust AI, the intelligence is going to improve itself so quickly that a new superhuman species is going to develop. So we're not even going to be able to relate to it anymore. So powerful will this artificial intelligence be? It's different in details from what Hegel was talking about with the Hegelian system, but it's similar in concept and in kind. Again, that through the results of human ingenuity, we're on the cusp of creating a new species, some kind of new way of living, right? And you can see the language that both Hegel and the guy who coined the term, or well, not, I guess he didn't actually coin the term singularity, but he certainly popularized it.
He popularized it.
Ray Kurzweil, who's now a Google executive, but he wrote a famous book called The Singularity Is Now. Look at the language that was used 200 years ago and is used today. You know, the great confidence that we're transitioning into a new era, and that somehow we're instilling the universe, the matter in the universe, with a new kind of intelligence and a new kind of spirit. Without going into, we don't have to explore the details, but the confidence of each age is clear, and this is the confidence that Kierkegaard felt palpably and wanted to respond to. So to Hegel and to the Hegelians that were so confident that we were on the cusp of a new era as a result of our intelligence and our technology, Kierkegaard asked, has being human now become something so different from what it was in the old days? Sure, people know more now, but is this knowledge potentially not just introducing confusion into the mix? Right? Kierkegaard's asking, great, we've got a ton more knowledge, we've got a lot more technology, there is undoubtedly progress in certain areas, but are we wiser than the ancient Greeks? Are we more virtuous? Are we more courageous? There are these existential issues that are equally important to us, if not more so than our technology and our understanding. Have we really made progress in those areas? Or are we confusing progress in technology with progress in these other equally important areas? To Hegel specifically, Kierkegaard had the famous what's the right put down, I guess. He could have made fun of Hegel a little bit. He said, Hegel forgot that he was an existing being. He said Hegel would go down in history as the greatest thinker who ever lived if he had just talked about his system as though it were a thought experiment and said, oh, I've got this idea, isn't it cool? But Hegel forgot that he was a finite human creature, and so believed that he could actually see the cosmos from an eternal or divine perspective, and this made him something of a humorous figure. And Kierkegaard likened him to an architect who built a magnificent castle, but then had to live beside it in a doghouse. Because Hegel could put together a system and say, here's how it all flows, and here's how it's all organized, but he could never actually live in that way, right? He had to go through life in a moment-by-moment, finite, uncertain way that we all do. And for Kierkegaard, keeping that in mind is the most important thing. Well, this kind of sentiment is echoed within Silicon Valley itself. Jaron Lanier is that he's the father of virtual reality. He was working in VR for the past 30 plus years. A really interesting writer, well worth reading. He's at Microsoft Research now. In fact, I think he's the guy who coined virtual reality.
Yeah.
He's the guy who made it famous. And I've never heard him quote Kierkegaard, but there's certainly a Kierkegaardian statement. The thing about technology is that it's made the world of information ever more dominant, and there's so much loss in that. It's like surrendering to a dwarf world. And this is a very Kierkegaardian point of information is great, it has its purpose, but it's not everything, and it isn't applicable in every human issue. So we're going to look in detail at two of those issues that Kierkegaard was obsessed with, and also Silicon Valley, love and death. So I suspect that a few of you are familiar with these names, eHarmony and Match, and God help us, Tinder. I didn't even want to put the logo on the screen. But here's an example of these are examples of the billions of dollars that Silicon Valley is putting into firms that propose that we can improve the way that we date, fall in love, use whatever terms you wish. And the Venn diagram that eHarmony uses I just love this image, all right? So on the left, it's a little too small for some of you to read, I think, but on the left in the science circle, you've got sciencey words, right? You've got big data and algorithms and machine learning. And on the right, in the love circle, you've got sort of more, nebulous love words like, attraction and emotions and meaning. And then interestingly enough, chemistry and energy. I'm not sure why those are love words rather than science words, but in the middle, you've got eHarmony, bringing it all together, right? Sort of applying its machine learning and its algorithms to the big data, and then, creating love made smarter. And I would be hard pressed to think of a phrase that would irritate Kierkegaard more than love made smarter, right? This would immediately stop him in his tracks. And he would say, all right, what are we actually talking about here, right? If we want to talk about love in any traditional sense of the term, we're talking about an individual, one person, examining themselves to say, what are my needs? What are my wants? What are my fears? What are my weaknesses? What do I need? And then connecting with another unique individual and getting to learn them and their unique needs and wants and fears and anxiety. And out of that, something that we might term love emerging, right? It's a one-on-one process. Kierkegaard would say, what does the data from 10 million other people have to do with that one-on-one process? He's not denying the effort. And I should have stated this at the beginning, Kierkegaard was no Luddite. Kierkegaard actually thought about being a biologist for a little bit. He was up on all the scientific advances of the day. He was a smart, attentive guy, but he was very concerned about category confusion. And he would say, this is great. You've got the data from 10 million people. You've got your fancy algorithms. You've got your machine learning. Does that actually apply to the one-on-one nature of what we're used to thinking of as love, or is this a distraction? Are we as individuals outsourcing our responsibilities to ourselves and to that person that I am supposed to love to a corporation to do that work for me? And is that even possible? And Kierkegaard might step back and ask the related question. Okay, we've got our mobile app now. I've got Match on mobile. We've got this tool. Are we better now at loving or at finding love than our grandparents were? Are we better at dating? And I think he would have asked that question in an objective way, right? Maybe we are, but how would you measure that? And if ways aren't immediately jumping to mind, Kierkegaard would say, maybe we have an issue here. The Economist, just a few weeks ago, I was glad to see this. This was helpful in my preparation. They actually The Economist ran as the cover story of their magazine an article on how the internet has impacted dating. And you can see from the subtitle that they want to talk about how better algorithms, business models, and data could have even more people finding partners. And it was intriguing to see The Economist run through the potential metrics that might be used. They gave it a shot in terms of matches made and how long did those matches last. It's not that it can't be done, but it wasn't conclusive. And it's interesting for a multi-billion-dollar business that we don't have a firmer handle on whether or not this technology actually can impact the issue at stake. And Kierkegaard would be all over this kind of discussion. Now, I should note that Kierkegaard also had very personal reasons for being interested in this. If you don't want to read Kierkegaard for the philosophy, that's fine. Read him for the love story. There aren't that many great philosophical love stories out there. I can think of maybe two others. So Kierkegaard had one of the few, and it was a good one. In all of Kierkegaard's books, he's writing indirectly about his former fiancée, Regine. Kierkegaard was a very prominent Copenhagen citizen, and he got engaged to another very prominent Copenhagen citizen by the name of Regine. They were engaged for 9 months, then Kierkegaard called it off suddenly, and without explanation to Regine. He just said, Regine, we're done. And this was a scandal. It was a scandal to both families. It was a scandal that was played out in the public papers. And then Kierkegaard doubled down I'm way off on a tangent now. This doesn't really have anything to do with Silicon Valley. This is just because it's a cool story. So Kierkegaard doubles down by, in his first book that he publishes, having a long chapter in there called The Seducer's Diary, in which he tells this false, salacious story, thinly veiled, of his relationship with Regine. I kid you not. So he broke up with her, then he published a long book about the things that supposedly happened when he was with Regine that painted neither him nor Regine in a good light. Of course, all of Copenhagen is scandalized, right? And then both of them waltz off in their separate directions. Kierkegaard never stops writing about Regine in veiled terms. Regine never stops thinking about Kierkegaard. She goes off to St. Thomas. They never get back together. It's this unrequited love story. But that's another reason to read Kierkegaard. That was my point in telling this story. All right? Where were we? We're heading back to death. We're leaving love behind. When we're heading back to the other issue that Silicon Valley spends a lot of time and money thinking about. The Silicon Valley's obsession with death probably hit public consciousness back in 2013 when Time magazine published this cover, Can Google Solve Death? In truth, there are a lot of firms in Silicon Valley that are looking seriously at ways that through biohacking, biotechnology, artificial intelligence, including the singularity that I mentioned before, are there ways that we can extend our lives, that we can eliminate death in some kind of way? Lots of time and money being spent on this issue. And if we had Larry Page and Sergey Gin from Google here, I don't want to paint with too unfair a brush here. If we had them come down and say, what are you guys up to down at Google with death? They would give the answers that you would expect. They would say, well, we're investing in all kinds of research to see if we can eliminate cell degeneration, if we can eliminate disease. We want to see if we can extend human life. Maybe there are things that we can do. And Kierkegaard would be all in favor of that. There's no one who's opposing this kind of research into extending human life. I mean, I don't think any of us in here would be. What Kierkegaard would want to know, though, or what Kierkegaard would suggest, is that, like love, this isn't purely a technological problem. We're not just machines that need to be fixed, that human issues like death play a much broader role in our lives. What's my next? And so if we had Larry Page and Sergey Brin here, Kierkegaard would look at them and say, hey, this is great that you've got this research project going on, but let's talk a little bit more about that. Do you know what death is, first of all? What do we know about that? And Kierkegaard would say, I've thought a lot about death, and indeed he did. He wrote a lot about it. Doesn't understand what death is, but he has a really good sense of the impact that death makes on human lives. So if you think about the other existentialist philosophers, Heidegger in particular, they're all fixated on the idea of how the thought of death impacts our lived lives, right? The fact that we know that we're finite creatures, that death is inevitable, that it's always approaching, that this changes the way that we live our daily lives, that life becomes that each moment is potentially imbued with a bit more importance and passion, right? You only have so many times that you can love. You only have so many times that you can be creative. You don't know what's coming next. Each moment might be your last. And so this issue of death really enhances or changes certain aspects of human life. And if we get rid of it, what does that do to the way that we're living our lives? And so Kierkegaard would look at the Google research team and say, hey, this is great, but is this purely a technology issue, or do you need to have some broader thinking here on your research board? And Kierkegaard might continue by saying, even if you succeed in this goal, let's suppose that we extend human life to 300 years long, or we extend it indefinitely, all right? Does it really change what you need to do on a daily basis as an individual existing human being? So, back to Kim Kierkegaard-Ashian, right? How many times does she want to go to Ibiza? How many photo shoots does she want to have in Paris? You know, those might get old after a while, but the most important things in our lives now, or in Kim Kierkegaardian's life, like investigating the questions of what does it all mean? What's the purpose of my life? How do I act with more integrity? How do I become a better family member? Those would never stop. Whether you were 300 years old or you live forever, you would always be asking those questions. And Kierkegaard comes back to that point again and again, that those central existential questions don't go away no matter how long you live. And so this would be a point that he would want us to think about and want the Google research team to think about as they're conducting the research efforts. I loved this Wired article for the picture and for the title. Silicon Valley would rather cure death than make life worth living. And at first glance, this looks like the kind of thing that Kierkegaard would sign up to. And I think Kierkegaard would probably agree that it's easier in a certain sense to cure death than to make life worth living. But the point that Kierkegaard would ultimately want to make to Wired magazine in the Silicon Valley, or the question that Kierkegaard would want to ask is, what can Silicon Valley do to make life worth living? Is there anything that it can do? So what iPhone iteration, what software technology advancement, what scientific advancement, full stop, really is going to make my life more worth living? It might make it more convenient in certain ways. It might make it better. It's certainly the case that I'm glad for medical advances that take away disease or that ease pain. I like my iPhone. I like I like a lot of the technological advancements to come out, but I don't know if it has qualitatively improved my life in the sense that I am a better, more fulfilled person as a result of this particular tech gadget. And Kierkegaard would want to make that point very, very clearly. In conclusion, I would say that the two things that Kierkegaard would want us to remember are that we shouldn't mistake superficial lifestyle improvements with qualitative changes to our lives, and that we should be very careful about confusing data and information and objective knowledge like that with understanding and with wisdom, right? The more subjective kinds of thinking that we do about ourselves. This ultimately was his point in response to the technology issue of the technology advances of his time. And I think it would be his response to Silicon Valley today. And with that, I'll open it up for questions. Please.
Do you believe that nobody's life has been made more worth living as a byproduct of technological innovation, like in Silicon Valley, like just in smartphones or convenience and social media?
He would argue, well, first of all, he was a fan of technology himself. He loved, the technology of his day was better carriage rides, better apartments, and better clothes. Those are the big ones. He would absolutely agree that technological advancements lead to superficial improvements in one's life. It makes us more comfortable. But it doesn't lead to more profound happiness, or it doesn't lead to improvements in ourselves as individuals. It doesn't lead us to be more virtuous or happier.
I know he came from like a rich background. Did he do any research on like if the amount of money you had affected like your happiness and the technology and stuff that you were able to get to?
Did Kierkegaard do any research?
Yeah. Or did you think about that at all?
Kierkegaard definitely didn't do any research. He thought a lot about it. It's a really good question because money and discussions of money are all over Kierkegaard's writings. He was very conscious of the fact that he had a lot of money. He was very conscious of the fact that towards the end of his life, when he was running out of money, that he wanted more of it. He was very conscious of the economic changes that were going on in his time, like the huge income disparities in the Danish population. That was also a big issue at that time as well. This in the same way that we talked about what Kierkegaard might have thought about technology, that's the same way that he tended to address monetary issues, where in superficial ways it's better to have more money than less, but it doesn't really change the most important things about the way that you live your life. All right, if you have a lot of money, you're not, although he didn't do any research as he suggested, you're not necessarily happier. You're certainly not braver. You're not necessarily more ethical, all right? And it was those more substantial, more subjective kinds of phenomena that he was interested in.
I know that he like wrote about love and everything, but did he ever write about like have children or like write about children?
That's it. Now you're hitting at a real weak spot at Kierkegaard. No, he didn't have any children of his own. He had some relatives, some younger relatives that he really had close relationships to, and he had some really, not in his books, but in his personal letters, he had some very kind correspondence. But a lot of scholars have thought that this was a blind spot for Kierkegaard. I mean, the fact that he wasn't married, he didn't have kids, he was a very solitary person, and that comes through in his writing often. So, a few kids around the house might have changed his writing in interesting ways.
So someone like Alan Turing comes to mind, who really was a driving force behind the first mechanical computing models, and his work during World War II saved a lot of lives by breaking the Nazi code. Would you say that's sort of an example of where technology, had a very profound impact on the quality of life of maybe everybody by ending that war 2 years early and possibly changing the outcome entirely?
Oh, in an objective sense, absolutely. Again, we have to distinguish between sort of the objective quality of life and the more subjective issues of how am I developing as a person, or how am I happy? Am I in a good place as an individual? From an objective standpoint, Kierkegaard would say that all this technology and this knowledge has been great. His life certainly benefited. Denmark as a whole certainly benefited. I mean, no one could deny that. His claim was that with the external improvements, which were all to the good, they didn't necessarily impact the way that we thought about ourselves and the way that we developed as individuals in healthy ways, and to a certain extent could become distractions. Weren't necessarily guaranteed to become such distractions, but he wanted to be careful about that. All right. So all the time that I spend, I won't address the Turing example, but because of course, ending World War II was great. But on a smaller level, all the time that I spend looking at my iPhone, that's time that I could be spending doing other things that are potentially more substantive. And I'm there on my iPhone, Googling things, thinking like, oh, I'm becoming smarter. Look at all this information that I'm looking up at this exact moment. But am I really thinking more clearly? Am I thinking at a deeper level? Am I broadening myself in more important ways? That's the kind of question that Kierkegaard wanted to ask.
And we should also consider the fact that World War II, as it existed, couldn't have existed to the disastrous extent that it existed without the technology in the first place, right?
Oh, that's an interesting way to take it.
So it's a great way of looking at how technology creates a big problem and then solves a big problem, but is it a hero in solving a problem that it created in the first place?
It's an interesting way to flip it around. Good question. Other questions?
We should probably discuss a little bit about because what I'm sensing from the questions is a confusion about maybe what Kierkegaard intends by the word happiness and what we typically associate with the word happiness. So we might think of it as a psychological state that we could get into. Maybe we could use technology to get ourselves into a technological state, a psychological state of happiness through VR or through drugs or something like that. And Kierkegaard has a much different, understanding of what happiness is, and linking it with virtue, right, which is maybe what is missing so far in this discussion.
I think that's a good point. It's certainly easier to see the difference with virtue. That's if we limited the discussion to that, to say, has all this technology made us better people as individuals, made us kinder or more courageous, more ethical? It's maybe easier to see the difference there. I would even on the subject of happiness by itself, I think I'd be willing to push it. I think Kierkegaard would be willing to push it in the direction of technology can create happiness. That's why all of us are using it more than we ever have before. But is it really creating qualitatively new kinds of happiness or making us happier overall? Again, are we as individuals happier than the generations who came before who didn't have Xbox and iPhones and what have you? It's not that there's any problem with using technology for enjoyment. This is why half of it is designed, but to then make the leap that this is creating a qualitatively new kind of happiness or improving us in some way. That's what Kierkegaard wants to warn against.
Do you think there is a way to measure or we can
People have certainly tried. There are lots of surveys. It's a really good question, and it's a. Oh, is there a follow up?
I'm just gonna say really quick.
Sure.
We didn't live in the so we don't know what those people were, right? We don't know previous generations' real happiness.
That's a good point too. I mean, we can only infer based on how they reported. But you're sort of actually in that clarification, that very good clarification, you're getting at one of the crux of the issues, in that we can't even, we can do surveys amongst our contemporaries about are you happy or what makes you happy. We can try to get to the bottom of that, and there are hundreds, if not thousands, of marketing firms and sociological institutes that attempt to do just that. Think about the news reports that come out every year about the rankings of the happiest countries, right? Scandinavia is always there up top, ironically enough, since they're a depressed alcoholic people.
But they read a lot of Kierkegaard.
Yeah, like you're,
And that helps.
but even in talking to each other in our room, face to face, even, how can we really tell whether someone is happy or not? And this is really at the core of what Kierkegaard is trying to get at, is that it's hard enough for me to look in the mirror at myself and say, am I happy? If so, why? Much less be able to make predictions about whether somebody else is happy. Right? There's a mystery in all directions there at this point.
And there also seems to be in Kierkegaard a sense of the value of not being sort of like deliriously happy, right? There's a more of a sense of the philosophical term eudaimonia, correct? Where you might not point to this person and say that person looks happy, but they are more self-fulfilled and therefore more happy from a philosophical standpoint than and that's a hard thing to like quantify or measure.
Right. It's a good point as well.
How do you think Kierkegaard would respond to Peter Singer's version of utilitarianism as far as the greatest good, happiness, the greatest number?
That's a good question. Did you hear him talk when he came here a few years ago?
I did, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I remember that lecture. Kierkegaard was very suspicious of crowds, and you saw in a few of the quotes that I included in the presentation. So any of that kind of utilitarianism where we're measuring crowds against an individual, Kierkegaard was skeptical of that. He really, for a variety of ways, but he wasn't sure that we were able to truly, I think Kierkegaard would be suspicious of our ability to measure what was really going on in the crowd and what, and then be able to compare it to what was happening with an individual. It's an interesting comparison.
And while we're thinking about it, sociologists have metrics that they use for happiness, and one way of getting around the fact that we didn't live 100 years ago or 1,000 years ago or 10,000 years ago is to utilize the science of anthropology, because we can find civilizations that are still existent that live in ways that are similar to older societies where they're still dealing with earlier versions of technology. So we can get some data, right, on family life and how much time people spend relaxing, how much time people have for their own projects, right? And we can make a kind of a metric on happiness, and see that you know, in a hunter-gatherer society with the measurements that we can take with actual hunter-gatherers who are still living, we can see that they spend, you know, nearly all of their day hanging out with their family, whereas us in our culture spend almost no time with our family, right? And so you can get a sense of how happiness can how you know, we can ask a very important ethical and philosophical question, which is that good, right? Is it good that the majority of the people on the planet don't spend a lot of time with their family anymore, whereas all humans up to this point spent tremendous amounts of time with their family, and not just their nuclear family, but their extended family, right? So so that would be a way of getting at what Kierkegaard asked this really important question, like, is this better? It is different, right? But is it better?
Another interesting way to frame it.
Mm-hmm.
And at the end of the day, what Kierkegaard really wants is Kierkegaard wants individuals, you know, us as individuals, to look in the mirror and say, what's going on with my life, right? You know, happiness is not the be-all, end-all, as Professor Solons mentioned, but even a question like, am I happy, right? If you're really asking that of yourself in a profound and serious way, it's a very difficult question to answer. And then you move on to other questions. You know, am I a virtuous person? Do I act with integrity? Does my life have meaning? Do I know what that meaning is, and am I working towards it as hard as I should be? Right? There are all those questions that an individual can only truly ask of him or herself, and that's what Kierkegaard was constantly prodding his readers to do. He wasn't necessarily making an argument saying, this is how I see the world, you know, tell me what you think. He was saying, I think that there are a lot of people in the world who are not asking themselves serious questions seriously enough, and I hope that with my books I'm able to prod them to do so. And he's looking at, you know, as we talked about during the presentation, he sees a lot of things in the world, be it technology, be it money, be it politics. He sees a lot of these as being things that sometimes people think help them move towards a deeper understanding of themselves or a more profound understanding of how they should live their lives, but in fact they're distractions. And that's ultimately what he's cautioning against.
Excellent, and that's an excellent way to end our discussion for today. We have these very short time to talk about very deep subjects. Let's thank Mark.
Thanks for the chance to come.